Hey guys, when we think of a honeymoon today, we usually imagine a private escape, white sand beaches, a quiet hotel, or maybe just some time alone away from the world. But if you were a newlywed in the 12th century, privacy was a luxury you almost never had. In fact, your first night as a married couple was often a public event. From the bedding ceremony, where your entire wedding party might literally tuck you into bed, to the legal necessity of proving the marriage was official, the medieval honeymoon was less about romance and more about contract and community. Tonight, we're going to look past the fairy tales. We'll talk about why couples drank honey wine for 30 days. What the morning gift actually meant for a bride's financial survival, and how the church slowly changed the rules of the bedroom. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's travel back to the drafty stone manors and thatched cottages of the Middle Ages. Before we continue, take a moment to like the video. Subscribe if you enjoy these slow journeys through history. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always comforting seeing people gathering here from around the world. Now, imagine the sound of rain against a wooden roof. A cold wind slips through the cracks of a stone manor somewhere in northern France. Torches flicker in iron brackets, throwing restless shadows across rough walls blackened by years of smoke. Outside, the village dogs bark in the distance, and the muddy courtyard still carries the footprints of wedding guests slowly making their way home. Inside the great hall, the celebration is ending. The musicians have grown tired. A servant quietly gathers half-empty cups from the long oak tables. Wax from burned candles drips slowly onto the floor like melting snow, and at the center of it all sit two people who barely know each other. The bride cannot be more than 16. Her hair is hidden beneath linen veils decorated with tiny stitched pearls. Beside her sits a young man in a wool tunic smelling faintly of horses, smoke, and damp winter air. This is not the beginning of a romantic getaway. This is the beginning of a contract. Modern honeymoons are built around escape. Couples leave behind work, family, noise, and responsibility. The honeymoon becomes a temporary dream, an island separated from ordinary life. But in medieval Europe, marriage worked very differently. A wedding was not mainly about two individuals falling in love. It was about families combining land, securing alliances, producing heirs, surviving winters, protecting property, and satisfying the expectations of neighbors, priests, and local lords. Even among peasants, marriage carried economic weight. A farmer needed hands to help manage animals, fields, and household labor. A woman entering a marriage often brought practical value through spinning, brewing, cooking, or connections between nearby families. Love sometimes grew later, sometimes it never arrived at all, and so, the idea of disappearing together into privacy after the ceremony would have seemed almost strange, because in medieval society, private life barely existed. Most peasants lived inside one-room cottages where parents, children, and sometimes animals slept close together at night. Even noble households were crowded with servants, guards, attendants, and relatives constantly moving through corridors and chambers. The medieval world was noisy. You heard footsteps on straw floors, church bells before sunrise, roosters in the dark, carts grinding through mud, blacksmiths hammering iron, babies crying through thin walls. Silence itself was rare, and privacy even rarer. That is why the medieval honeymoon was not designed to isolate a couple from society. Instead, it marked their entrance into society. Marriage transformed people into recognized adults with duties that affected everyone around them. A successful marriage meant stability for the community. An unsuccessful one could create disputes over inheritance, land, and legitimacy, which is why people paid attention, very close attention. In some villages, neighbors would escort newlyweds all the way to their sleeping chamber while laughing, singing, or carrying candles. Nobles sometimes experienced elaborate ceremonies involving prayers, blessings, and witnesses standing nearby. To modern ears, it sounds intrusive, but to medieval communities, it felt necessary. The marriage needed to become visible, recognized, proven. And beneath the torchlight of those stone halls, another truth quietly lingered. Life in the Middle Ages was uncertain. Disease could sweep through a village in weeks. Winters could destroy harvests. Childbirth carried terrifying risks. A husband might die in war, from infection, or during a simple hunting accident. Marriage was not simply emotional companionship, it was survival. This made the first days after the wedding deeply important. Every ritual carried meaning. Every gesture hinted at law, religion, fertility, wealth, or social order. Even the drinks served at the feast mattered. Even the doorway into the marriage chamber mattered. Even the bed itself mattered, and as the fire in the great hall slowly burns lower, as exhausted guests begin whispering among themselves, the newly married couple rises from the table. People notice immediately. Conversations soften. The room watches, because the strangest part of the medieval honeymoon is only just beginning. Tonight, the couple will not walk alone into privacy. They will be followed, and in the next chapter, we step deeper into the shadows of the wedding feast to discover what happened after the music stopped, and why entire communities sometimes escorted newlyweds directly to bed. The fire crackles softly at the center of the hall. Outside, rainwater drips from the edges of the roof into the muddy courtyard below. Most of the wedding feast has dissolved into exhaustion now. A few older guests still sit at the long tables with flushed cheeks and heavy eyelids, nursing cups of dark ale while musicians lazily pluck the final notes from worn stringed instruments. The celebration has lasted for hours, sometimes days, but the most important moment of the evening has not yet arrived. The bride lowers her gaze, the groom shifts awkwardly beneath the attention of dozens of watching eyes, and then, slowly, someone stands. Perhaps it is the bride's mother, perhaps the village priest, or perhaps a drunken uncle already smiling before the ritual even begins. But once that first figure rises, everyone else understands. It is time. In the modern world, weddings usually end with departure. A car driving into the night. Guests waving goodbye beneath lights and music. The newly married couple escaping into privacy while everyone else returns home. But medieval weddings did not separate the couple from the community. Instead, the community followed. The transition from feast to bedchamber was often treated almost like a second ceremony. Guests escorted the newlyweds through torchlit corridors or across muddy village paths with loud singing, teasing jokes, and blessings meant to encourage fertility and luck. To modern minds, it can feel strangely uncomfortable, yet for medieval people, this public attention transformed the marriage into something undeniable, visible, witnessed, real. In noble households, the procession could become highly elaborate. Servants carried candles through narrow stone passages while tapestries shifted gently in cold drafts. Priests sometimes offered prayers before the chamber door. Wealthier brides might remove ceremonial gowns heavy with embroidery and jewels while female attendants helped prepare the marriage bed. Even among peasants, where conditions were simpler, customs remained surprisingly communal. Neighbors crowded into tiny cottages. Laughter filled the room. Children peeked curiously from corners. The newlyweds rarely experienced silence, and beneath all of this noise sat an uncomfortable truth. The marriage was expected to become physical, not eventually, not someday, soon. Medieval society viewed consummation as deeply important because marriage existed within both religious and legal systems. A union that was never consummated could sometimes be challenged, questioned, or even annulled. This created enormous pressure. especially for young couples who barely knew one another. Some brides were frightened, some grooms were equally terrified, though far fewer people admitted it. Imagine standing before a room full of relatives after hours of eating and drinking. While everyone quietly anticipates what will happen next, the emotional weight must have been immense, and yet medieval people surrounded these moments with ritual because ritual made uncertainty feel manageable. In England, France, and parts of the Germanic world, guests sometimes escorted couples directly to the bed itself. Songs were sung. Crude jokes echoed through chambers. Shoes might be thrown. Blessings were whispered. The room glowed with candlelight and smoke. Some customs were playful, others carried older echoes from ancient folk traditions tied to fertility, protection, and communal approval, and all the while, the newlywed stood at the center of attention, not hidden, observed. A medieval marriage chamber could look very different depending on wealth. A noble bed might include carved wooden frames, embroidered blankets, feather mattresses, and curtains designed to block cold air. Yet even wealthy rooms remained dim and drafty by modern standards. A peasant cottage offered even less separation from daily life. Straw covered packed earth floors. Smoke from indoor fires clung to walls and clothing. Chickens sometimes wandered nearby. There was no luxury resort waiting beyond the ceremony, no peaceful escape, only ordinary life continuing almost immediately. And perhaps that is what makes medieval honeymoons feel so distant from modern fantasies. Today, marriage often represents personal fulfillment. In the Middle Ages, marriage represented obligation entering the room like a silent guest. The couple carried not only their own emotions but the expectations of parents, priests, neighbors, and future generations. Children were expected, property mattered, inheritance mattered, survival mattered. Even love, when it existed, had to survive beneath those heavier structures. As the wedding feast faded into night, the newlyweds moved toward a threshold that symbolized far more than intimacy. It marked their entrance into adult responsibility, and waiting beyond that doorway was one of the strangest customs of all, because in many medieval communities, the couple would not be left entirely alone, not yet. In the next chapter, we enter the unsettling world of the bedding ceremony itself, where laughter, ritual, embarrassment, and law collided beside the marriage bed beneath the watchful glow of candles. The corridor smells of smoke, damp wool, and melting candle wax. Footsteps echo softly against the stone floor as the wedding guests continue guiding the newly married couple deeper into the manor. Behind them, the sounds of the feast still linger faintly in the distance, laughter fading into tired murmurs, wooden cups scraping against tables, the final drifting notes of a harp somewhere beyond the great hall. But here, in the narrower passages of the castle, the atmosphere begins to change. The celebration grows quieter, more focused. The bride keeps her eyes lowered beneath the folds of her linen veil while servants carrying candles illuminate the walls with restless golden light. Beside her, the groom forces small smiles whenever relatives clap his shoulder or whisper jokes meant to ease the tension, yet everyone understands what is happening. This is not merely a walk toward sleep, this is ceremony, and perhaps one of the strangest ceremonies in medieval life. The bedding ceremony. To modern audiences, the idea sounds almost impossible to imagine. A crowd escorting newlyweds into their bedroom. Friends and family gathering around the marriage bed itself. Songs, prayers, teasing laughter, and public rituals surrounding what today would be considered intensely private, but in medieval Europe, privacy existed differently. Marriage was not viewed as an entirely personal bond hidden away from society. It was a public transformation recognized by the entire community. The bedding ceremony symbolized that transformation in the clearest possible way. Once the couple reached the chamber, the ritual truly began. The room glowed softly beneath candlelight, smoke drifted lazily upward toward dark wooden beams overhead. Thick curtains surrounded the bed to help trap warmth against the freezing night air creeping through the castle walls. Embroidered blankets rested carefully atop straw mattresses stuffed with feathers or wool. For nobles, the ceremony could become elaborate and highly formal. Female attendants sometimes helped undress the bride while male companions prepared the groom nearby. In royal courts, important political marriages occasionally involved astonishing numbers of witnesses. Chroniclers even recorded nobles escorting kings and queens directly to bed while priests offered blessings nearby. For peasants, the customs were usually simpler but no less communal. Inside cramped cottages, neighbors squeezed together shoulder to shoulder. Candles flickered against clay walls while older women whispered advice to embarrassed brides. Laughter erupted suddenly, then faded again into murmured conversation. The atmosphere often balanced strangely between humor and seriousness, part celebration, part obligation, part nervous performance, and underneath it all sat a quiet awareness that the marriage now needed to become fully complete. In many places, guests performed symbolic acts before leaving the chamber. Some removed the bride's shoes. Others braided charms into bedding or scattered herbs believed to protect fertility and ward away evil spirits. In parts of medieval England, guests might throw stockings toward the couple for luck. Elsewhere, songs filled the room, some gentle and religious, others embarrassingly crude. The newlyweds themselves rarely controlled the pace of events. The community did, and for young couples, especially those in arranged marriages, the emotional experience must have felt overwhelming. Many brides entered marriage barely beyond childhood. Some grooms were equally inexperienced. They stood surrounded by relatives, priests, servants, and neighbors while expectations pressed against them from every direction like the heavy stone walls around the chamber itself. Fear mixed with exhaustion. Embarrassment mixed with duty, and still the ritual continued. Historians believe bedding ceremonies served several purposes at once. Public involvement reduced doubts about whether the marriage had truly occurred. Witnesses confirmed that the couple shared the same bed. Families demonstrated approval. Communities reinforced social order. The ceremony transformed intimacy into something socially visible, and medieval society deeply valued visibility. A hidden marriage could create dangerous legal disputes over inheritance or legitimacy later on. Public rituals helped eliminate uncertainty, yet despite the noise and crowds, moments of humanity still emerged quietly inside these chambers: a nervous glance, a trembling hand, a whispered reassurance. Two strangers suddenly realizing that every familiar part of life has ended. Outside the room, the medieval world continued turning beneath cold moonlight. Dogs barked in distant courtyards, wind brushed against wooden shutters. Somewhere beyond the manor walls, villagers slept beneath leaking roofs while monks prayed through the night inside candlelit monasteries. The world remained uncertain. Harvests could fail, disease could arrive without warning. Winter could starve entire communities, and perhaps that uncertainty explains why medieval societies surrounded marriage with so many rituals. Rituals created structure against chaos. They gave ordinary people the comforting illusion that life could be guided safely from one stage into the next. Birth, marriage, death, everything marked carefully through ceremony. Eventually, the bedding chamber would begin to empty. Guests drifted toward the doorway one by one. Their laughter softened into tired whispers. Candles burned lower. The air grew still. At last, the heavy wooden door slowly closed. For the first time all evening, silence approached, but even then, the couple's privacy remained incomplete, because in some places, people still expected proof that the marriage had truly been consummated. The heavy wooden door closes with a low groan. For a moment, silence settles over the chamber like falling snow. The candles burned softly beside the bed, their small flames trembling whenever cold air slips through the cracks in the shutters. Outside, somewhere beyond the stone walls, a horse shifts in the stable yard. Rain taps quietly against the roof above. The newly married couple finally stands alone, or at least almost alone, because one of the strangest truths about medieval marriage is that complete privacy did not always begin when the door closed. Sometimes, it barely began at all. In many parts of medieval Europe, witnesses remained deeply connected to the wedding night itself. Their role could be formal, symbolic, or uncomfortably direct depending on the region, social class, and century. To modern minds, it sounds invasive beyond imagination, but to medieval society, witnesses represented security, proof, protection against future disputes that could destroy families, property claims, or political alliances. A marriage was not simply emotional, it was legal. And legality required evidence. Inside noble courts especially, the stakes surrounding marriage could become enormous. Entire kingdoms depended on legitimate heirs. Land, titles, castles, and dynasties all rested upon whether a union was considered lawful in the eyes of both church and society. That is why witnesses mattered so much. Some stood outside the chamber door listening for signs that the marriage had been consummated. Others remained nearby long enough to confirm the couple had entered bed together. In rare royal cases, attendants and officials documented details surrounding the ceremony with astonishing seriousness. To us, these customs feel deeply uncomfortable. To medieval people, they reduce dangerous uncertainty. Imagine a world without photographs, legal databases, or official identification documents. Memory and public testimony carried enormous weight. If a powerful noble later claimed a marriage had never truly occurred, witnesses might become the only defense against chaos, and so, medieval communities watched carefully. The atmosphere surrounding these moments often balanced between awkward humor and quiet tension. Outside some bedchambers, drunken guests laughed together in corridors while waiting for symbolic confirmation that the marriage was complete. Older women exchanged gossip near candlelit staircases. Servants carried fresh logs to the hearth while pretending not to listen too closely. Yet beneath the teasing atmosphere lingered genuine seriousness, because consummation could determine inheritance. Without it, marriages sometimes faced annulment, especially among nobles. The church increasingly insisted that mutual consent created a valid marriage, but consummation still strengthened the union legally and spiritually. Over centuries, medieval canon law became tangled in debates surrounding vows, sexuality, legitimacy, and evidence, and ordinary people found themselves trapped inside those systems. For young brides especially, the pressure must have felt enormous. A noble woman might understand that her ability to produce heirs would shape not only her future, but the survival of entire bloodlines. Even peasant women faced expectations tied to labor, fertility, and household survival. The wedding night carried social consequences far larger than personal emotion, and still, amid all this pressure, human vulnerability quietly remained. Picture a candlelit chamber deep inside a stone castle. The bride sits silently at the edge of the bed while muffled laughter echoes faintly from beyond the door. The groom stares into the fire, exhausted from hours of ritual and celebration. Neither truly knows the other. Both understand they are being measured by invisible expectations pressing from outside the room. It is difficult not to feel sympathy for them. Modern stories often portray the Middle Ages as endlessly loud and dramatic. But many medieval nights were probably filled with quieter emotions: nervousness, embarrassment, loneliness, resignation, occasionally tenderness. The witnesses themselves were not always cruel or intrusive by intention. In many communities, their presence symbolized communal support. Marriage affected everyone around the couple. If disaster struck, through illness, death, or dispute, the wider community would become involved. Medieval life was deeply collective. People rarely survived alone. That collective mentality shaped everything from farming to religion to marriage itself. Even architecture reflected it. Castle chambers remained connected through narrow corridors filled with servants and guards. Peasant homes contained entire families within single smoky rooms. Monasteries structured daily life around communal rhythms of prayer, bells, and shared labor. Privacy, in the modern sense, was a rare luxury. Most people passed their entire lives surrounded by others, and perhaps that explains why medieval witnesses did not always perceive themselves as violating intimacy. Their society understood intimacy differently. Marriage belonged partly to the community, not just the couple. Eventually, though, the corridors outside the chamber would grow quieter. The guests drifted away toward sleeping pallets and dying hearthfires. The laughter faded. Footsteps disappeared into darkness, only distant rain remained, and inside the chamber, the candles continued burning lower beside the marriage bed, but even after the witnesses left. Another powerful force still hovered over the medieval honeymoon, the law, because in the Middle Ages, consummation was not merely tradition or expectation. By midnight, most of the castle has fallen silent. The wedding feast exists now only as scattered remains across the great hall below, cold meat forgotten on wooden platters, overturned cups near dying candles, puddles of wax hardened upon long oak tables. Somewhere in the darkness, servants quietly sweep rushes from the floor while exhausted musicians sleep beside the embers of the hearth. Above them all, behind thick stone walls and heavy wooden doors, the newlyweds remain awake beneath the weight of expectation, not merely social expectation, legal expectation, because in the medieval world, marriage was not fully secured through emotion alone, nor even through the wedding vows themselves. The law demanded something more, consummation. To modern people, marriage often feels deeply personal, a relationship defined privately between two individuals. Governments may issue certificates, but love itself remains the center of the story. In medieval Europe, however, marriage belonged simultaneously to family, community, church, and law. It was emotional for some couples, certainly. But it was also economic, political, religious, and legal all at once, and consummation sat at the center of that complicated web. A marriage could be celebrated publicly before dozens of witnesses. Priests could bless the union beneath candlelight and incense. Families could exchange property, gifts, and promises, yet without consummation, questions sometimes remained. Was the marriage truly complete? Could it be challenged? Could it be undone? These questions mattered enormously because medieval society depended heavily upon inheritance and legitimacy. Land passed through bloodlines. Noble titles depended on recognized heirs. Even among peasants, property rights and family obligations relied upon stable marriages acknowledged by both local communities and religious authorities. Without clarity, disputes could become disastrous. Imagine two rival families arguing over a dead lord's estate. One side claims the marriage was lawful, the other insists it was never consummated and therefore invalid. Suddenly, bedrooms become battlefields for legal argument, and this was not rare imagination. Medieval courts genuinely heard cases involving consummation, impotence, annulment, and disputed marriages. Church officials questioned witnesses. Midwives sometimes testified. Private matters became public records discussed beneath the authority of bishops and canon lawyers. The bedroom did not remain entirely private because medieval law refused to leave it there. By the High Middle Ages, the Catholic Church increasingly shaped marriage law across Europe. Earlier customs had varied widely between regions, but church authorities slowly worked to standardize expectations surrounding consent, sexuality, and legitimacy. One major change involved the growing importance of mutual agreement between bride and groom. In theory, both individuals needed to consent freely to marriage. This was surprisingly significant in a world dominated by arranged matches and family negotiations. Yet consent alone still existed beside consummation, not entirely above it. A marriage recognized by vows became even stronger after physical union. Medieval theologians and legal scholars debated these distinctions endlessly. Some argued that spoken consent created marriage itself, while consummation completed it irrevocably. For ordinary people, these arguments filtered downward into daily life through priests, courts, and communal customs, and so the wedding night carried legal weight far beyond romance. A nervous young couple lying awake beneath rough wool blankets might not fully understand canon law, but they understood expectation. They knew people were watching, waiting, judging. Even royal marriages faced these pressures. Imagine two rival families arguing over a dead lord's estate. One side claims the marriage was lawful, the other insists it was never consummated and therefore invalid. Suddenly, bedrooms become battlefields for legal argument, and this was not rare imagination. Medieval courts genuinely heard cases involving consummation, impotence, annulment, and disputed marriages. Church officials questioned witnesses. Midwives sometimes testified. Private matters became public records discussed beneath the authority of bishops and canon lawyers. The bedroom did not remain entirely private because medieval law refused to leave it there. By the High Middle Ages, the Catholic Church increasingly shaped marriage law across Europe. Earlier customs had varied widely between regions, but church authorities slowly worked to standardize expectations surrounding consent, sexuality, and legitimacy. One major change involved the growing importance of mutual agreement between bride and groom. In theory, both individuals needed to consent freely to marriage. This was surprisingly significant in a world dominated by arranged matches and family negotiations. Yet consent alone still existed beside consummation, not entirely above it. A marriage recognized by vows became even stronger after physical union. Medieval theologians and legal scholars debated these distinctions endlessly. Some argued that spoken consent created marriage itself, while consummation completed it irrevocably. For ordinary people, these arguments filtered downward into daily life through priests, courts, and communal customs, and so the wedding night carried legal weight far beyond romance. A nervous young couple lying awake beneath rough wool blankets might not fully understand canon law, but they understood expectation. They knew people were watching, waiting, judging. Even royal marriages faced these pressures. Across medieval Europe, kings and queens sometimes married for diplomacy rather than affection. Entire alliances depended upon successful unions producing heirs. Chroniclers recorded anxieties whenever royal marriages remained childless for too long. Whispers spread quickly through courts. Was the marriage consummated? Was one spouse infertile? Could the union be annulled? These questions could destabilize kingdoms. Yet beneath all this political tension remained deeply human emotions: fear, shame, confusion, loneliness. Many medieval people probably entered marriage carrying little practical knowledge about intimacy. Formal education was rare. Open discussion varied widely depending on region and religion. Young brides especially may have felt frightened stepping into unfamiliar chambers beside near strangers while enormous expectations surrounded them. The law offered structure, but structure did not guarantee comfort, and medieval law could become surprisingly intrusive. In some annulment cases, courts examined whether consummation had physically occurred. Witness testimony mattered. Medical opinions sometimes appeared. Humiliating details entered official records preserved for centuries afterward. Modern readers often find these cases unsettling, yet medieval society feared uncertainty more than intrusion. An unclear marriage threatened inheritance, legitimacy, and social stability. Law attempted to control those dangers through investigation and ritual. Outside the chamber windows, the medieval night stretches onward. Rain clouds drift slowly across the moon. The village sleeps beneath darkness broken only by scattered candlelight glowing through shutters. Somewhere in the distance, monks rise before dawn prayers while stable boys stir beside cold barns. Life continues, and within that life, marriage remains one of society's most important foundations, not because medieval people were uniquely obsessed with romance. The rain has finally stopped. Beyond the castle walls, the medieval countryside rests beneath a silver wash of moonlight. Wet grass glimmers softly in the fields. Thin streams of mist drift low across the earth like wandering spirits moving silently between sleeping villages. Inside the manor, the fires have burned low. Most of the guests now sleep beneath wool blankets and animal furs, their breathing mixing with the distant crackle of dying hearths. The wedding feast is over. The rituals are fading into memory, and somewhere in the quiet darkness, two newlyweds begin the uncertain first hours of married life. It is here, in the silence after celebration, that the strange old word begins to make sense. Honeymoon. Today, the word feels soft and romantic. It suggests beaches, travel, candlelit hotels, temporary escape from ordinary responsibility, but its older meaning carried something far more ancient, something tied to honey, to moonlight, and perhaps to the fragile sweetness of happiness itself. Historians still debate the exact origin of the word honeymoon, but one of the strongest medieval traditions connects it to mead, a fermented honey wine consumed across Europe for centuries, in parts of northern Europe especially. Newly married couples were sometimes given enough mead to last for an entire lunar month after the wedding, one moon, one cycle of the night sky. A honeymoon. The idea sounds almost poetic when whispered beside a midnight fire, yet like many medieval customs, it existed at the intersection of practicality, superstition, and hope. Mead itself was ancient even by medieval standards. Long before vineyards spread widely across Europe, people fermented honey into golden alcoholic drink. Mead appeared in feasting halls, monasteries, royal courts, and peasant gatherings alike. Its flavor varied depending on herbs, fruits, and local traditions, but it often carried symbolic associations with celebration and fertility. And fertility mattered deeply. Marriage in the medieval world was expected to produce children. Heirs protected land, continued family lines, and ensured survival in dangerous times. A childless marriage created anxiety not only for nobles, but for ordinary households relying on labor and inheritance. Honey carried ancient symbolic connections to life and abundance. So did the moon. The moon governed tides, seasons, planting cycles, and religious calendars. Medieval people lived far closer to nature's rhythms than most modern societies. They watched the sky carefully because survival depended upon understanding changing seasons and weather. A lunar month of honey wine therefore felt meaningful. Blessed, protective, some believed the mead improved fertility or strengthened the marriage bond. Others simply treated it as joyful celebration after exhausting wedding rituals. Perhaps it was both. Picture a wooden cup resting beside a candlelit bed. The room smells faintly of smoke, beeswax, and damp linen. Outside, wind brushes against the shutters while clouds drift slowly across the moon. The newlyweds drink quietly together, not in luxury, not in privacy untouched by society, but in a fragile pause before ordinary life fully begins. And perhaps that pause is the closest medieval people came to what we now imagine as a honeymoon, not escape from life, but a brief softening of it. The sweetness, however, carried an older warning hidden inside the word itself. Some scholars believe honeymoon originally hinted at temporary happiness, the sweetness of honey fading as quickly as the changing moon. Early married life might begin warmly, but medieval people understood how quickly hardship could return. Winter, disease, debt, pregnancy, loss. The medieval world rarely allowed comfort to last forever, and so even joyful traditions often carried shadows beneath them. This mixture of sweetness and melancholy appears everywhere in medieval culture. Songs about love ended with death or separation. Religious art balanced beauty against suffering. Feast days arrived beside famine years. People learned to treasure small moments because life itself felt uncertain. Mead became part of that emotional landscape. Inside great halls, nobles drank from decorated cups while musicians performed beneath banners and torchlight. In humble cottages, peasants shared simpler brews near smoky hearths after long days of labor. Honey wine connected rich and poor through shared ritual, and after the wedding feast ended, its warmth lingered quietly into the night. Some medieval medical beliefs even claimed honey possessed healing properties. Monastic writings described it as nourishing and restorative. Combined with alcohol, mead occupied a curious place somewhere between celebration, medicine, and folk tradition. It soothed nerves, encouraged sleep, perhaps eased fear, and fear surely existed beneath many medieval marriages. Not all unions were loving, not all couples chose one another freely. Some marriages united strangers from distant regions or rival families. Young brides left familiar homes forever. Grooms inherited responsibilities they barely understood, yet despite uncertainty, people still searched for moments of tenderness. A shared drink beside candlelight, a quiet conversation while rain touched the roof, the brief illusion that the outside world had paused, that may be the true emotional heart hidden inside the word honeymoon. Not endless romance, but temporary shelter from the harshness waiting beyond the chamber door. Outside, the moon continues drifting over fields and forests darkened by sleep. The night grows colder, and by morning, medieval life will begin again with all its ordinary demands: animals to feed, fires to tend, servants to command, fields to plow, children eventually to raise. Morning arrives slowly over the medieval countryside. A pale grey light spreads across the fields beyond the manor walls while mist clings low to the damp earth. Roosters call from distant farmyards. Somewhere below the castle windows, servants already move through the courtyard carrying buckets of water and bundles of firewood. The wedding feast is over now. The musicians have gone quiet. The candles burned themselves into pools of hardened wax long before dawn, and yet the honeymoon, at least in its older medieval meaning, has only just begun. For some newly married couples across medieval Europe, tradition spoke of 30 days of honey wine. A full cycle of the moon, 30 nights. Marked not by travel or luxury, but by ritual, shared drink, and the uncertain transition into married life. The idea feels strangely peaceful from a distance, a month wrapped in sweetness before ordinary burdens settle fully onto the shoulders of husband and wife. But medieval reality was never entirely gentle. Even during this symbolic honeymoon, responsibilities waited patiently nearby like shadows beyond candlelight. Still, the custom endured because it offered something precious: a pause, a breathing space. Between ceremony and routine, imagine a noble household waking after the wedding celebrations. Servants quietly replace rushes on the stone floors. Cold air slips through narrow castle windows while cooks prepare dark bread and broth in smoky kitchens below. The bride, no longer dressed in ceremonial fabrics and jewels, now wears simpler clothing suited to daily life. Already, the transformation has begun. Yesterday she was daughter, today she is wife, soon, perhaps, mother. The groom faces his own changes as well. Land management, military duty, trade responsibilities, family expectations, all stretch before him like roads disappearing into fog. Marriage in the medieval world altered identity almost overnight, and this is where the honey wine tradition gained emotional power. For a brief period, the newlyweds existed in between stages of life, not entirely strangers anymore, not yet fully settled into routine. The mead shared during these days symbolized warmth, fertility, prosperity, and blessing. In some regions, families provided enough honey wine to last through the first lunar month of marriage. Whether every household followed the tradition exactly remains uncertain. But the symbolism survived across centuries because it resonated deeply with medieval fears and hopes. Honey represented abundance, the moon represented time itself. Together, they created a fragile ritual against uncertainty. An uncertainty surrounded medieval life constantly. A noble woman entering a new household might leave behind everyone familiar to her. Castles could feel cold, foreign, and isolating despite their grandeur. Political marriages especially forced young brides into unfamiliar courts where every gesture carried meaning. Peasant women experienced different but equally difficult transitions. A village bride often moved into her husband's family home, sharing cramped space with in-laws, children, servants, or farm laborers. Privacy remained rare. Work began almost immediately: cooking, cleaning, brewing, spinning wool, feeding animals. There was no long escape from responsibility, no distant coastline waiting beyond the ceremony, only life continuing, and perhaps that is why the honey wine mattered emotionally. It softened the transition. At night, after the labor of the day finally ended, the couple might sit quietly beside the hearth while shadows flickered across wooden walls. A cup of mead passed slowly between them. Outside, rain tapped against thatched roofs or winter wind moved through the trees. In those moments, marriage may have briefly felt less like obligation and more like companionship, not always romantic, but human. The moon itself held enormous importance in medieval imagination. People tracked planting seasons, tides, feast days, and religious calendars through lunar cycles. The changing moon seemed to govern invisible rhythms within both nature and human life. A marriage blessed through one complete moon cycle therefore carried symbolic balance, completion, harmony. Some folk beliefs even connected lunar phases to fertility and conception. Medieval medicine blended strangely with superstition, religion, and inherited folklore. Herbs, prayers, astrology, and seasonal rituals often existed side by side without contradiction. To modern minds, these beliefs can feel distant, yet beneath them lies something familiar. People wanted reassurance, they wanted protection against fear. The medieval honeymoon offered no guarantee of happiness, but it provided structure in a dangerous world where disease, famine, childbirth, and war could shatter ordinary life without warning. Even sweetness carried urgency because life felt uncertain. Picture a winter evening deep inside a medieval manor. Snow gathers quietly outside the walls while servants extinguish torches one by one along the corridor. The newly married couple sits near the hearth beneath dim amber light. A cup of honey wine rests between them. Perhaps they speak softly, perhaps they sit in silence, perhaps they barely know each other still, but for one brief moment, the outside world feels distant. The fields can wait until morning, the responsibilities can wait until morning, the future itself can wait. By the second morning after the wedding, the castle begins returning to ordinary life. Servants hurry through narrow corridors carrying water, linens, and baskets of bread. The great hall no longer echoes with music or drunken laughter. Instead, the familiar rhythms of medieval routine slowly reclaim the household. Horses must be fed, accounts must be checked, fires must be maintained against the cold, and somewhere behind the heavy doors of the marriage chamber, the bride awakens not as a guest anymore, but as part of an entirely new life. The honeymoon sweetness already begins to thin like smoke disappearing into winter air. Yet amid these changes, another ritual quietly waits. A gift, not a romantic souvenir, not jewelry exchanged beside a beach or distant sunset, but something far more serious, the Morgengabe, the morning gift. To modern ears, the phrase sounds gentle, almost poetic. But beneath the softness of the name stood a deeply practical tradition shaped by fear, survival, and the uncertain position of women in medieval society. In parts of medieval Germany, Scandinavia, and across sections of Northern Europe, husbands gave their wives a gift on the morning after consummation. The exact form varied depending on wealth and local custom. For nobles, the gift might include land, silver, livestock, property rights, or income from estates. For peasants, it could be simpler, a valuable household item, animals, coins, or promises tied to inheritance, but the emotional meaning remained surprisingly consistent: security, because medieval women lived inside a world where security could vanish quickly. A husband might die from fever within weeks, war could erase entire households, childbirth itself remained dangerous enough to haunt nearly every family. And for many women, survival depended heavily upon what legal protections marriage provided. The morning gift acknowledged this uncomfortable reality openly. It recognized that marriage was not only about affection or fertility. It was also about financial stability in a harsh and uncertain world. Picture a cold northern morning inside a medieval manor. Grey light enters through narrow windows while frost gathers faintly along the edges of the glassless shutters. The fire has burned low during the night. Heavy curtains surround the marriage bed to keep warmth trapped inside the chamber. The bride sits quietly beneath wool blankets while the groom presents a small wooden chest. Inside rests a silver brooch, or a written claim to land, or perhaps a ring carrying the seal of his family, not merely decoration, protection, a promise that if widowhood comes, and widowhood came often in the Middle Ages, she will not be left entirely helpless. In noble marriages, the Morgengabe sometimes became politically significant. Land granted through the morning gift could provide long-term income for widowed queens or noble women. Documents recording these agreements survived in legal archives for centuries afterward. Behind the soft candlelight of the wedding chamber stood careful calculations about inheritance and survival. Even love had paperwork attached to it. For peasant women, the realities felt less grand but no less important. A cow could mean milk through winter, a chest of linens could protect dignity, rights to portions of land or shared property might determine whether a widow survived after losing her husband. The medieval world rarely offered women independent economic power. Marriage therefore became one of the few paths toward stability, even though it also created vulnerability. And vulnerability surrounded nearly every stage of life. Modern audiences often imagine medieval weddings through fairy tale images, castles, gowns, feasts, romance glowing beneath torchlight, but the people living through these marriages understood something harsher. Life was fragile. A woman entering marriage needed safeguards because the future could collapse without warning. Disease spread quickly through crowded towns. Accidents happened during travel, farming, hunting, or war. Even wealthy households feared sudden death constantly. That fear shaped customs like the morning gift, yet despite its practical purpose, the tradition also carried emotional symbolism. The first morning after the wedding marked transition. The bride no longer belonged fully to her childhood household. She now stood between two identities, the life she had lost and the unfamiliar one beginning around her. The gift acknowledged that crossing. In some ways, it served almost as reassurance. You are recognized here, you have value here, you will not be discarded easily. Whether reality always matched those promises is another question entirely. Some medieval marriages became deeply unhappy. Others involved cruelty, neglect, or political manipulation. Legal protections varied wildly depending on class, region, and local customs, but even imperfect protections mattered in uncertain times. Outside the chamber windows, morning spread slowly across the estate, servants sweep the courtyard. Crows gather near muddy roads, smoke rises from village chimneys beneath pale winter skies, and somewhere beyond the manor walls, countless ordinary women begin another day of labor, baking bread, carrying water, feeding children, tending animals. Most will never appear in royal chronicles or illuminated manuscripts, yet traditions like the morning gift reveal their hidden anxieties more clearly than any battlefield or king's decree ever could. Because beneath the ceremonies and candlelight, the morning light grows stronger now, spilling across the stone courtyard in soft, washed tones. Dew clings to the edges of grass and wooden beams. The castle is no longer asleep, but it has not yet fully awakened either. Everything feels suspended, caught between night's silence and the steady rhythm of daily work returning. Inside the manor, life continues quietly after the wedding, but for the bride, something has already changed in a way that cannot be undone, not because of emotion, not because of celebration, but because of economics. In the medieval world, marriage was one of the most important financial arrangements a woman would ever enter. It was not simply a union of two people, it was the merging of resources, obligations, and survival strategies between families, and for the bride, financial security was never assumed, it had to be constructed, carefully, deliberately, piece by piece. The morning gift, the dowry, the inheritance rights, and family agreements all formed a fragile system designed to protect her position inside a society where women's independence was limited by law, tradition, and circumstance. Once the wedding feast ended, the real negotiations often became more visible. Land might be assigned, livestock counted, jewelry catalogued, written agreements confirmed in the presence of witnesses. Even the smallest details carried weight, because in medieval life, wealth was not abstract. It was survival made visible. A cow meant milk for children, a field meant grain through winter, a chest of linens meant dignity and stability in a world where replacing anything required labor and time. For noble women, financial security often depended on complex legal structures. Marriage contracts could include jointure arrangements, dower rights, or land specifically set aside for a wife's maintenance if she became widowed. These arrangements ensured she would not be left powerless if her husband died or political alliances shifted, but the protection was never absolute. It depended on documentation, on witnesses, on the stability of families and kingdoms that were themselves fragile. For peasant women, financial security looked different but felt just as urgent. A peasant bride often entered her husband's household with a dowry of her own. Simple goods, tools, clothing, or animals provided by her family. In return, she gained access to shared resources and labor within the household economy. But her safety still depended heavily on the strength of that household. If her husband died, remarried, or fell into poverty, her position could change overnight. Medieval life rarely offered guarantees, only arrangements that tried to delay hardship. Picture a small village at the edge of a forest. Smoke rises from thatched roofs while chickens scatter across muddy paths. Women carry water from a shared well. Men sharpen tools near wooden fences. Children run between cottages while dogs bark lazily in the background. Inside one of these homes, a new bride now begins her daily life. There is no extended honeymoon journey, no separation from labor or responsibility. Instead, she joins the rhythm of the household immediately, cooking, cleaning, spinning wool, preparing food for winter storage. The transition is seamless and unceremonious, yet beneath it lies the structure of financial survival. Every action contributes to the household economy, every skill becomes part of her value within it. In noble households, the structure is more visible but not necessarily easier. A castle is filled with servants, accounts, inventories, and obligations stretching outward into estates and villages. A noble bride must learn quickly how to navigate unfamiliar systems of power and property. She is expected to understand alliances, hospitality, household management, and sometimes even political influence, her financial position is tied not only to her husband, but to the stability of his entire lineage, and still, despite these complexities, medieval society often spoke of marriage in emotional terms: blessings, love, harmony. But behind those words, financial reality remained. Constant security was never just personal, it was structural. Even the church, which increasingly shaped medieval marriage law, understood this balance. While emphasizing spiritual unity, it also acknowledged property rights, inheritance rules, and legal obligations that protected both parties. At least in theory, marriage sermons often reminded couples of duty as much as devotion, and duty, in medieval life, always included material stability. Outside the manor, the countryside continues its slow rhythm, fields stretch beneath pale sky. Rivers cut quiet paths through the land. Markets prepare for trade. Life moves forward regardless of individual joy or sorrow, and somewhere within this larger system, each marriage becomes another small link in the chain of economic survival. The honeymoon, then, was never truly an escape from responsibility. It was the moment before responsibility fully settled into place, a brief threshold between ceremony and structure, between promise and consequence, between celebration and calculation. As the days pass after the wedding, the bride's new reality becomes clearer. Her value is not measured only in affection or companionship, but in contribution, in inheritance, in stability, and yet, within this system, small moments of humanity still exist: a shared meal beside a hearth. The idea of departure never truly arrives. There is no carriage waiting beyond the castle gates. No journey planned toward distant shores. No quiet escape into an unknown paradise where the world fades into nothing but two people and endless silence. Instead, the medieval morning continues exactly as it always has. The same bells ring from the nearby church tower, the same smoke rises from village chimneys, the same labor begins in fields that have existed for generations, and the newly married couple remains exactly where they are. This is one of the most surprising truths about medieval honeymoons. They rarely involved travel at all. For most people in the Middle Ages, leaving home was rare, expensive, and often unnecessary. Roads were slow, dangerous, and unpredictable. Bandits, weather, and distance all made long journeys difficult. Even nobles traveled cautiously, often with armed escorts and careful planning. For peasants, travel was even more limited. Most villagers lived and died within a small radius of land they knew intimately, the same fields, the same riverbanks, the same neighboring settlements. So when a marriage took place, it did not usually include a journey afterward. It included return to work, return to responsibility, return to life already in motion. Inside a modest medieval cottage, the morning after marriage might feel almost indistinguishable from any other day. A fire must still be lit, bread must still be prepared, animals must still be fed, water must still be carried from the well. The only difference is subtle, almost invisible to outsiders. Two lives have been legally and socially joined, but the landscape around them has not changed. And perhaps that is what makes medieval marriage so different from modern expectations. Today, honeymoon culture is built on the idea of escape, a temporary separation from routine, a symbolic journey into privacy, romance, and rest. But in the medieval world, there was little from which to escape. Life itself was routine. Work and survival formed the constant background of every household. Even among nobility, going away after marriage was not a universal practice. Some royal or aristocratic couples did travel to estates or secondary residences, but these movements were usually tied to political, economic, or administrative needs rather than leisure. A castle was not a retreat, it was a working center of power. Fields still needed management, taxes still needed collection, servants still needed direction, so even when couples moved, they moved into new responsibilities rather than away from them. Imagine a newly married noblewoman stepping into a different castle for the first time. The stone walls are unfamiliar, the corridors longer than she remembers, the servants unknown to her, but there is no pause in activity to allow her adjustment. Household duties continue immediately. She learns by observation, by instruction, by necessity, and always under the quiet pressure of expectation. For peasant couples, the transition is even more direct. There is no change of residence in most cases. The bride simply becomes part of her husband's household structure. Sometimes living under the same roof as his parents, siblings, or extended family, privacy is rare, space is shared, life is communal, even rest happens within earshot of others, and yet, within this lack of physical separation, something else quietly forms: familiarity. Slowly, over days and weeks, the couple begins to adjust to one another's rhythms. Small patterns emerge. Shared routines develop. Conversations become less formal, less cautious, not through escape, but through repetition, through proximity, through the steady passing of ordinary time. Outside, the medieval world continues its unchanging cycle. Markets open in nearby towns where merchants sell grain, cloth, salt, and iron. Farmers tend fields that follow the same seasonal patterns year after year. Church bells mark hours that feel both rigid and comforting. Everything moves. But slowly, change exists, but it is measured in seasons rather than days. In that kind of world, marriage is not a break in life, it is an integration into it, and so the question, where did they go, begins to reveal its answer: nowhere, because there was nowhere to go in the modern sense of escape, only forward, into shared responsibility, into household life, into the social fabric that already surrounded them. Even the emotional meaning of marriage reflects this structure. Love, when it appears in medieval records or literature, often grows gradually rather than arriving all at once. It is shaped by shared survival, mutual labor, and long familiarity, not sudden transformation, but slow formation, and perhaps that is why medieval honeymoon traditions focused less on travel and more on ritual moments, mead, gifts, ceremonies, witnesses, and communal involvement. They were not marking a departure, they were marking a transition into permanence, a joining of lives that would remain physically close by default. As the morning settles fully into the day, the couple moves through familiar spaces once more: the courtyard, the kitchen, the fields. Each step reinforcing the reality that marriage does not remove them from their world, it embeds them deeper within it. And still, even within this grounded reality, medieval people found ways to create meaning: a shared glance during work, a brief moment of rest beside a fire, a quiet exchange of words while the world continued around them. Small things, but in a world without escape, small things mattered. Because they were what remained when everything else was constant. Anna's. The day continues its slow unfolding. The first true days of marriage begin not with celebration, but with adjustment. The castle no longer feels like a place of ceremony. It becomes something closer to a living system, breathing, moving, demanding attention in quiet but constant ways. Doors open and close. Water is carried. Fires are rebuilt. Voices echo through corridors that never truly fall silent, and within this rhythm, the newly married bride is no longer a guest. She is being absorbed, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, like ink spreading through cloth. In medieval society, marriage rarely created a separate household in the modern sense. More often, it inserted a person into an existing structure that had already been functioning for years, sometimes generations. A husband's family, a noble estate, A peasant household, a working system already in motion, and now, the bride becomes part of it. At first, everything feels unfamiliar, even simple tasks require learning. Which rooms belong to whom? Which servants carry which responsibilities? Where food is stored? How accounts are managed? When prayers are spoken? When labor begins and ends, there is no pause for orientation, life continues immediately. Inside a stone manor, the new bride may walk through halls filled with servants who already know their duties better than she does. They move with practiced certainty while she observes quietly, trying to understand the invisible structure holding everything together. No one explains the entire system at once, it is learned through repetition, through mistakes, through observation. And through silence. In noble households, integration is often social as much as practical. The bride must learn the etiquette of her new position. How to speak to guests. When to remain silent. How to host gatherings. How to present herself in the presence of clergy, visiting lords, or royal messengers. Every gesture carries meaning, a slight bow, a delayed response, a carefully chosen phrase. These small details determine how she is perceived within a world where reputation travels faster than written letters, and reputation is everything. For peasant women, integration is more physical and immediate. A new bride may join her husband's family home, where generations already live under one roof. She is expected to contribute from the first morning onward, preparing food, maintaining the hearth, helping in fields, caring for animals, and assisting with seasonal labor. There is no ceremonial separation between marriage and work, they arrive together. In many ways, the household itself is the center of medieval life. It is not only a place of residence but a unit of production, survival, and identity. To be part of a household is to be part of an economy, and to be part of an economy is to be part of survival. Within this system, relationships form slowly, not through dramatic revelation, but through shared routine, a moment of cooperation in the kitchen, a brief exchange while carrying water. A quiet understanding formed during long hours of labor. The bride begins to recognize patterns in those around her, who speaks often, who remains silent, who holds authority, who avoids it. These observations shape her place within the household as much as any formal instruction, and always, beneath these adjustments, runs an undercurrent of emotional uncertainty. She has left one world entirely, even if the physical distance is small. The psychological distance is immense. Her childhood home, her family. Familiar faces, familiar rhythms, all replaced by a new environment that requires patience to understand. Yet medieval society does not frame this transition as loss, it frames it as continuity, a cycle. Daughters leave one household to strengthen another, families connect through marriage, communities maintain stability through these exchanges. From a broader perspective, integration is not disruption, it is structure. But from the individual perspective, it can feel like quiet disorientation. Even the smallest sounds of daily life begin to shift meaning. Footsteps in the corridor belong to unfamiliar servants, laughter in the hall belongs to new relatives. The rhythm of prayer bells comes from a church that is no longer entirely hers. And yet, slowly, familiarity begins to grow, not dramatically, but steadily, through repetition of ordinary days. Morning light entering the same windows, the same fire being lit in the same hearth, the same voices repeating the same routines. Over time, the unfamiliar becomes predictable, and predictability, in the medieval world, is comfort. Outside the manor, the wider world continues its slow, unchanging cycle. Fields are plowed in preparation for planting seasons. Markets reopen in nearby towns. Trade routes carry goods between distant regions. Everything moves according to rhythms that existed long before any individual marriage began. The household is simply one small part of that larger structure. Inside it, the bride's identity gradually shifts. She is no longer defined solely by her origin, but by her role within the system she has entered. Wife, daughter-in-law, household member, worker. Each label carries expectations, responsibilities, and limits, and yet, within those limits, space still exists for adaptation, for small negotiations, for quiet influence, a suggestion accepted, a task adjusted. A relationship softened over time. Medieval households were not static. The word honeymoon begins to feel uneven when placed against the weight of medieval life, because while the term suggests a shared experience, the reality of marriage in the Middle Ages was never the same for everyone. It shifted depending on wealth, rank, land, and the silent structures of power that shaped every part of existence. What a noble couple experienced after their wedding could look entirely different from what a peasant couple faced just a few miles away, and yet, both lived in the same world, under the same sky, bound by the same rules of survival, in a grand stone castle. A noble marriage often came with ceremony extending beyond the wedding feast itself. There might be travel between estates, visits to family lands, or short periods of relocation depending on political or administrative needs, but even this movement was not leisure in the modern sense. It was responsibility disguised as travel. A noble couple might move from one manor to another to inspect land, manage tenants, or strengthen alliances. Carriages or horses carried them slowly along rough roads, accompanied by servants, guards, and household staff. There was no sense of escape. Every journey had purpose, every stop had obligation. Inside the castle, life was structured and hierarchical. The bride, often from another noble family, would be expected to adapt quickly to a new environment of servants, etiquette, and political awareness. Her marriage did not remove her from work, it changed the nature of her work. Instead of physical labor, she might oversee household management, hospitality, and the subtle politics of noble life. Guests had to be received, alliances maintained, reputation carefully preserved through every conversation and gathering. Even silence could be meaningful in such environments, a delayed response, a missed greeting, a poorly timed absence, everything carried weight. Now contrast this with the peasant reality, a few miles away, in a small village surrounded by fields and forests. Marriage brings no travel at all, no carriages, no distant estates, no ceremonial journeys. The couple remains where they already were, in the same cottage, the same village, the same land they have always known. For peasants, there is no separation between wedding and work. The honeymoon does not exist as a pause, it dissolves immediately into routine. The bride wakes the next morning and begins labor alongside her new household. Cooking over a shared hearth, carrying water from wells, helping with planting or harvest depending on the season, repairing clothing, feeding animals. The rhythm is immediate and unbroken. What changes is not location, but association. She is now part of a new family unit, often living with her husband's parents or extended relatives under one roof. Privacy is limited. Space is shared. Work is collective, even rest happens in the presence of others, and yet, within this crowded simplicity, something else forms slowly over time. Familiarity. Where noble marriages are shaped by distance and formality, peasant marriages are shaped by proximity and repetition. Two people working side by side every day begin to understand each other not through grand gestures, but through small, constant interactions. How one moves in the kitchen, how the other responds to fatigue, how decisions are made during difficult seasons. There is no escape into separate worlds, only adaptation within a shared one. Meanwhile, noble couples may spend more time apart even after marriage. Political duties, estate management, travel between properties, or court obligations can separate spouses physically for long periods. Their relationship may be maintained through letters, reports, or brief reunions rather than constant companionship. In contrast, peasants rarely have that distance. Their closeness is enforced by necessity, but that closeness also creates its own form of stability. Neither version of marriage is easier. They are simply shaped by different pressures, one by structure and hierarchy, the other by labor and survival. Both exist within the same medieval reality, but they occupy different layers of it. And this is where the idea of a universal honeymoon begins to break apart, because there is no single experience that defines it. For nobles, the early days of marriage might include formal gatherings, estate transitions, and managed introductions to a new social world. For peasants, those same days are indistinguishable from ordinary life. Except for the legal and social bond that has now been formed, no escape, no pause, only continuation. Even emotionally, the differences are complex. A noble bride might feel the pressure of reputation, politics, and expectation from multiple families watching her every action. A peasant bride might feel the pressure of labor, survival, and integration into a household that depends on her immediate contribution. Both live under expectation, just expressed in different languages. Still, within both worlds, small human moments exist. A shared meal eaten in silence after long work, a glance exchanged across a crowded room, a brief moment of understanding during difficult labor. These are not grand romantic gestures. They are quieter, more durable, and perhaps more reflective of medieval life itself. Outside the manor walls, the countryside continues its slow rhythm. Fields are worked, rivers flow, markets open and close, seasons shift without pause. Life moves forward in cycles that do not wait for individual happiness or hardship. Marriage is simply one part of that cycle, not a disruption, but an integration. And as noble and peasant lives continue side by side in the same medieval world. As evening returns, the medieval world grows quieter again. Church bells drift across the countryside, their sound carrying through valleys, over rooftops, and into the still air above sleeping villages. Inside homes and manors, people pause briefly, some in prayer, some in habit, some simply because the rhythm of life has taught them to listen. The first night of marriage, in particular, never truly belonged only to the couple. In medieval Europe, it also belonged to the church, not physically present in every chamber, but spiritually and socially woven into the expectation surrounding the marriage bed, because marriage, in the eyes of medieval Christianity, was not just a private agreement between two individuals. It was a sacred institution, a sacrament in later theological understanding, a binding structure shaped by divine order as much as human need, and that belief reached into even the most intimate moments of married life. Before the wedding night even began, many couples would have already been guided through religious rituals, prayers, blessings, and instructions from priests reminding them of duty, fidelity, and moral expectation. Marriage was framed not only as companionship or survival, but as a spiritual responsibility to form a household, to produce legitimate heirs, to live within the boundaries of accepted moral conduct, and this framework did not disappear when the ceremony ended. It continued into the night. In some regions, clergy played a direct role in blessing the marriage chamber. A priest might pray over the couple or offer symbolic words before they entered the room where they would begin their life together. The intention was not intrusion in the modern sense, it was sanctification, to place the marriage under divine protection, to align the couple's union with spiritual order. Even the physical environment of the chamber reflected this influence. In wealthier households, religious symbols might be placed near the bed, crosses, small icons, or blessings written on parchment and kept within the room. These objects were believed to protect the marriage from misfortune, illness, or spiritual harm. In humbler homes, the presence of religion was simpler but still deeply felt, a prayer spoken quietly, a blessing remembered from the ceremony, a sense that God was not distant, but observing, and perhaps that awareness shaped how people experienced the first night itself. For many medieval couples, intimacy was not only a personal moment, it was a moral one, a moment understood through the lens of duty as much as emotion. This does not mean medieval people lacked affection or tenderness. But it does mean their understanding of marriage carried layers that modern perspectives often separate: physical union, legal union, spiritual union, all intertwined. The Church also placed boundaries around marriage that shaped behavior in subtle ways. Certain days of the religious calendar discouraged or prohibited marital relations. Fasting periods, holy seasons, and specific feast cycles all influenced when intimacy was considered appropriate. This meant that even within marriage, timing mattered. Life was not entirely spontaneous, it was structured by rhythm, by doctrine, by expectation, and couples lived within those rhythms whether they fully understood the theological reasoning or simply followed tradition. On the night of the wedding itself, however, those broader rules softened into something more immediate. The room grows dim, candles burn low against stone walls. Outside, the wind moves slowly through trees and over fields that have already gone dark. Inside, the couple sits at the threshold of a new life, aware, perhaps more than at any other moment, that their union carries meaning beyond themselves. In noble households, this awareness might feel even heavier. Political alliances, inheritance lines, and dynastic expectations all converge into a single marriage. The Church's influence reinforces that weight by framing the union as something both sacred and socially necessary. A marriage is not only between two people, it is part of a larger moral and cosmic order. Among peasants, the tone is different but no less shaped by religion. The Church is often the center of village life. Its teachings guide birth, death, work, and celebration. The priest may know the couple personally. The wedding itself likely took place inside or near the church, so the idea that God is connected to the marriage bed is not abstract, it is familiar, present, almost ordinary. And yet, despite all this structure, the night itself remains deeply human. Two people sit in a room together, perhaps strangers, perhaps familiar, perhaps somewhere in between. The fire has faded, the noise of celebration is gone, only quiet remains, and in that quiet, expectations soften into something less formal. The Church's influence is still there, but it becomes part of the background rather than the foreground. A moral framework rather than an active voice. What remains in the center is simply the transition from public life to private life, from ceremony to continuity, from ritual to reality. Medieval people may not have described it this way, but they lived it constantly. Religion shaped the meaning of marriage, but life itself shaped how that meaning was experienced. Outside the chamber, the medieval world continues without pause. Monks chant in distant monasteries. Night watchmen patrol castle walls. Villages sleep under heavy skies. The rhythm of time does not slow for any individual moment of intimacy or uncertainty, and yet, within that vast structure, the first night of marriage remains significant, not because it is isolated, but because it is integrated into everything around it: faith, law, family, community. The medieval year does not move in a straight line, it bends, it pauses, it tightens and releases again in a rhythm shaped not only by seasons, but by something far more powerful in daily life: the church calendar. To modern eyes, time is mostly practical, days measured by clocks, weeks by schedules, months by convenience. But in the Middle Ages, time carried layers of meaning that determined when people worked, when they rested, when they traveled, and even when they were allowed to marry or be intimate within marriage, the liturgical calendar was not just a religious guide, it was a structure for life itself, and within that structure existed certain days considered forbidden, restricted, or spiritually unsuitable for marital relations. These were not minor suggestions, they were widely believed rules that shaped behavior across entire communities: fast days, holy seasons, periods of penance, major religious observances. On such days, couples were expected to abstain from marital intimacy, even within marriage, as an act of discipline, devotion, or respect for sacred time. To modern perspective, this can feel restrictive, but in medieval society, it was part of a larger worldview where physical life and spiritual life were deeply intertwined. Time itself was sacred, and every moment carried moral weight. Imagine a medieval village in early spring. Fields are beginning to thaw after winter. Farmers prepare tools for planting. Smoke rises from chimneys as people return to longer days of labor, but the church bell rings differently now. It signals a fasting period. The atmosphere of the village shifts subtly, not through enforcement alone, but through shared belief. Meals become simpler, celebrations quieter, marriages might be postponed. And within existing marriages, couples adjust their routines according to what the church considered appropriate for the season. These restrictions were especially common during major religious periods such as Lent, Advent, and other penitential cycles, times when reflection, restraint, and spiritual discipline were emphasized. For noble households, these rules were often observed with formal seriousness. Priests and chaplains attached to estates would remind families of the calendar. Household schedules would adjust accordingly, even influencing when feasts or social gatherings were held. Even powerful families were not entirely outside the structure of sacred time. For peasants, the experience was more communal and less formally enforced, but no less influential. The village priest was often central to daily life. His reminders shaped expectations. His teachings reinforced the rhythm of the year, and because medieval communities were tightly connected, social pressure helped maintain those rhythms. Everyone knew when restraint was expected, everyone knew when celebration was permitted. Time became a shared moral experience. Inside this framework, marriage existed not as a single event but as a continuing condition shaped by seasonal rules. The wedding night might occur freely, but the days and weeks that followed could be influenced by the calendar in ways that modern couples rarely experience. There were times when intimacy was encouraged as part of fertility blessing traditions, and times when it was discouraged or even considered spiritually inappropriate. This created a strange rhythm within married life. Periods of closeness, periods of restraint, all shaped by the passage of religious time rather than personal choice alone. And yet, medieval people did not necessarily view this as unnatural. For them, life was full of cycles: harvest and famine, work and rest, feast and fast, light and darkness. The liturgical calendar simply extended that cycle into moral and spiritual dimensions. Even the idea of time itself felt different. Days were not only numbered, they were named, associated with saints, feasts, sacred events remembered across generations. So when a couple entered marriage, they were also entering a calendar that would continue to shape their lives long after the wedding feast ended. Picture a small candlelit room in winter. A couple sits quietly after a long day of labor. Outside, wind moves through bare trees. Inside, the fire burns low. They are married, but they are also aware that tomorrow, or next week, or the next feast day might shift what is expected of them, not through law alone, but through belief. And belief, in the Middle Ages, carried real weight. It influenced behavior even when no one was watching, especially in matters considered sacred or morally significant. The Church's guidance was not always experienced as strict punishment. In many cases, it was understood as Protection, a way to align human life with divine order, to avoid sin. To maintain spiritual balance, to live correctly within a world that was always uncertain. Still, there is an undeniable tension beneath it all, because human life does not always move in rhythm with calendars, feelings do not always obey feast days, relationships do not always follow seasonal rules, and medieval couples lived within that quiet tension constantly, between desire and discipline. Between personal life and communal expectation, between the natural flow of human connection and the structured rhythm of sacred time. Outside the village, the world continues. In the quiet hours of medieval life, when the fire has burned low and the world outside settles into darkness, belief does not disappear, it simply changes shape. It moves away from formal sermons and church rituals, and into something older, quieter, and deeply personal: superstition, charms, small acts of hope performed in silence. For medieval couples, especially in the early days of marriage, fertility was not just a private desire. It was a social expectation, a family necessity, and often a matter of survival. Children meant continuity of land, inheritance, and labor. Without them, a household could slowly weaken, even vanish, and because of that pressure, people reached for anything that might help. Religion offered prayers, but folk tradition offered something else: protection. Across medieval Europe, fertility charms and rituals existed in countless forms, often passed quietly between generations, especially among women. These practices rarely appeared in official records, but they lived strongly in oral tradition and everyday behavior. Some were simple, others deeply symbolic, and many existed in the space between faith and fear. A bride might carry herbs believed to encourage fertility, plants like rosemary, sage, or fennel, woven into small bundles and kept near the body or under bedding. These were not just decorations. They were believed to influence unseen forces, gently guiding the future toward life and abundance. In some regions, special foods were prepared for newlyweds, chosen for their symbolic meaning. Honey for sweetness and prosperity. Eggs for new life. Bread for stability and nourishment. These foods were not random, they reflected a worldview where symbolism and reality were closely connected. Even colors mattered. Red was often associated with life, vitality, and protection. White with purity and transition. Green with growth and renewal. These meanings shaped clothing, ribbons, and household decorations during and after the wedding period, but superstition did not exist only in objects, it also lived in actions. A medieval bride might step carefully over a threshold when entering her new home, guided by the belief that crossing boundaries incorrectly could bring misfortune. Thresholds were considered spiritually sensitive places, points where the known world met the unknown. In some traditions, couples avoided certain actions during the early days of marriage, not because of law, but because of fear of attracting bad fortune. Spilled salt, broken objects, or unlucky omens observed in daily life could be interpreted as warnings. The medieval mind often searched for meaning in coincidence, not because people were irrational, but because uncertainty was constant. When life feels unpredictable, patterns become comforting, even imagined ones. Inside a humble cottage, a newly married couple might sleep beneath simple wool blankets while small protective objects rest nearby. A carved charm. A sprig of dried herbs. A piece of cloth stitched with symbols meant to ward off harm. Outside, the wind moves through fields and trees, carrying the sounds of distant animals and shifting weather. Inside, the world feels smaller, more contained, more manageable. In noble households, superstition took different forms, often blending with formal religion rather than replacing it. Wealthier families might commission embroidered fabrics or blessed objects from monasteries. They might consult learned individuals who combined medical knowledge with astrology and traditional belief. Astrology, in particular, played a quiet but persistent role in medieval thinking. The positions of stars and planets were believed by many to influence health, temperament, and fertility. A marriage timed under favorable celestial conditions was thought to carry greater harmony. Even physicians of the time sometimes incorporated such ideas into their understanding of the human body. The boundary between science and belief was not sharply defined, it was layered, flexible, interwoven. For peasant communities, however, superstition was often more immediate and practical. It lived in daily habits rather than formal theory. A whispered blessing before sleep. A charm tied above a doorway. A ritual repeated without explanation because it has always been done. These practices offered something important: control, or at least the feeling of control, because medieval life offered very little certainty when it came to fertility. Infant mortality was high, childbirth was dangerous, disease could alter a family's future overnight. In that environment, hope often needed physical form: a charm, a ritual, a belief carried in the hand or hidden in the home. Even within marriage itself, superstition shaped expectations subtly. The early period of married life was often watched carefully by family and community members, who interpreted signs of pregnancy or fertility with intense interest. Every change in behavior, health, or routine could be noticed, discussed, and interpreted. The pressure was quiet but constant, and yet, despite all this weight, there is something deeply human in these practices, a desire not only for children, but for reassurance, for stability, for the continuation of life in a world that often felt fragile. At night, when silence settles over the village or castle, these beliefs become even more present in the mind. Shadows on walls seem deeper. Wind sounds more meaningful. Small noises in the dark carry imagined significance. There are moments in medieval life that seem ordinary at first glance, yet carry meanings layered far deeper than stone, wood, or earth. One of those moments is the act of crossing a threshold, a doorway, a simple boundary between outside and inside, between the world beyond and the world within. In the Middle Ages, this act was never truly simple. It was symbolic, sometimes even sacred, when a bride entered her new home for the first time. Especially after marriage, she did not simply walk through a door in the modern sense of convenience. She crossed into a new identity, a new household, and often a completely new life structure. And because medieval people believed the world was filled with invisible influences, good fortune, bad fortune, blessings, and unseen forces, the threshold itself became a place of caution and meaning. The space between outside and inside was considered sensitive, unstable, a point where change occurred, and change, in medieval thought, always required care. In many traditions across Europe, brides were gently guided, or in some cases even carefully lifted, over the threshold of their new home. This was not universal, but the symbolism behind it was widespread enough to appear in multiple regions and variations. The idea was simple in form, but rich in meaning: to avoid misfortune, to ensure good beginnings, to protect the fragile transition from one life stage to another. Picture a small medieval village at dusk. The sky is heavy with fading light, shifting from pale gold to deep blue. Smoke rises from thatched roofs. Dogs bark in the distance. A river nearby moves slowly, reflecting the last colors of the evening sky. At the edge of the village stands a modest home. Wooden beams, stone foundation, a low doorway slightly worn by years of use, and now, a newly married couple stands before it. The bride hesitates for only a moment. Not out of fear, but awareness, because everyone present understands that this is not just entry into a building, it is entry into a life. Inside the house, firelight flickers softly against walls darkened by years of smoke. The space is familiar to the husband's family, but unfamiliar to her. Every object inside carries a history she did not grow up with, every corner holds routines she must now learn, and so the threshold becomes more than physical architecture, it becomes psychological transition. In noble households, this symbolism is even more pronounced. A castle gate or grand doorway is not just an entrance, it is a controlled point of access. Guards, servants, and retainers all move through it according to strict order. Crossing into such a space means entering a world of hierarchy, expectation, and visibility. When a noble bride arrives at her husband's estate, her passage through the entrance is often witnessed. Not in a dramatic way, but in a structured one. Servants observe. Household members note arrival. The movement is recorded in memory, if not always in writing. Her crossing is not private, it is acknowledged, because she is now part of the household's identity. In peasant life, the threshold carries a quieter intimacy. There are no ceremonies, no formal witnessing, only family members nearby, continuing their work even as a new chapter begins within the same space, and yet, even in simplicity, meaning remains, because in medieval thought, thresholds were places where the ordinary world and the uncertain world touched, where fortune might shift, where blessings might be needed, where beginnings required care. Some traditions involved small gestures meant to ensure good luck upon entry. A blessing spoken softly. A moment of pause. In some regions, symbolic objects or rituals accompanied the crossing, though these varied widely and were shaped more by local custom than uniform rule. What connects them all is not uniform practice, but shared belief, the idea that beginnings mattered, that how something starts could influence how it unfolds. Inside the home, once the threshold is crossed, life continues immediately, there is no pause. No separation between symbolism and reality, the couple enters the same space where daily life will now unfold, cooking, sleeping, working, speaking, living. The threshold marks the end of arrival, but not the end of transition. It simply opens the next stage, and perhaps that is why it holds such quiet emotional weight in medieval imagination, because it is one of the few moments where change is visible in a single step. Outside the doorway, the world remains unchanged, the village continues its rhythm. Fields lie dark under evening sky. Smoke drifts upward in thin lines. The sounds of labor slow as night settles in, but inside that house, something fundamental has shifted. A new household has formed, not through declaration alone, but through entry, through crossing, through passage from one state of life into another. In noble castles, this idea expands further. Entire corridors and gates become symbolic transitions. Moving deeper into a castle often means moving closer to authority, responsibility, and visibility. Rooms are arranged in layers, and crossing from one to another can feel like passing through invisible boundaries of rank and access. The bride's movement through these spaces reflects her gradual integration into a structured world. Each doorway is a small threshold, each passage a quiet adjustment. Even in monasteries and churches, thresholds held meaning. Sacred spaces were entered with awareness. Long before the honeymoon, before the feast, before even the ceremony itself. There is a quieter moment that decides everything, the meeting, or sometimes, the first real glimpse of a future that has already been decided by families, alliances, and necessity. In medieval Europe, many marriages were arranged. Not always without consent, and not always without personal choice, but rarely built on the modern expectation of romantic familiarity. Instead, they were shaped by negotiation, between families, between landowners, between political interests, inheritance lines, and survival strategies. Love, if it appeared, came later, or slowly, or not at all, and yet, within this system, the moment of first impression still mattered. Even when the marriage was agreed upon, there was often a quiet tension before the couple fully stepped into their shared life. A first real look. A first conversation. Sometimes a brief encounter during negotiations or betrothal gatherings. These moments were small, but they carried weight, because from them, people formed expectations about the future. In a medieval noble court, this first impression might take place in a controlled setting, an audience hall, a family gathering, or a ceremonial introduction. Candles flicker against stone walls. Tapestries hang heavy with inherited stories. Servants move quietly in the background, aware that something important is unfolding even if no grand announcement is made. The bride and groom may observe each other across a space filled with witnesses. Not alone, never entirely private, every gesture becomes part of memory. The way one stands, the way one speaks, the way silence is held between words. These details, however small, begin to form the early shape of a shared life. In peasant communities, arranged matches are often more direct and less formal. Families agree through discussion, observation, and necessity. The couple may already know each other from village life, perhaps as neighbors, perhaps as distant acquaintances, perhaps barely at all, but even here, first impressions matter. A working presence in the fields, a reputation for skill or reliability, a family standing within the village, all of these shape the perception of the future partner before marriage even begins. There is no grand introduction, only recognition, and then acceptance. What is striking in both noble and peasant contexts is how restrained these early interactions are. Medieval society does not rush toward emotional expression in these moments. Instead, it holds back, observes, waits, because marriage is not yet life together, it is preparation for it. In noble settings, families often emphasize lineage during these introductions. The bride is not just a person, but a continuation of alliances. The groom is not just an individual, but a carrier of inheritance and responsibility, so when they meet, they are also meeting the weight of their families. History is present in the room. Even if unspoken, in peasant life, the emphasis is more practical. Can this union support the household? Will labor be balanced? Will land and work be sufficient for survival? The emotional layer is not absent, but it is framed within necessity, and yet, despite all this structure, something quietly human still emerges: curiosity, uncertainty, awareness of change approaching. A first impression in medieval marriage is not a single defining moment. It is the beginning of interpretation, a process that continues into the wedding, into the first night, into the early days of household life. Because people are not fully known in an instant, they are revealed slowly, through shared time. After the initial meeting, life returns to its broader rhythm. Negotiations continue. Preparations advance. The wedding date is set or confirmed. Households prepare for the transition that will follow, and in the space between first impression and marriage, something subtle happens. Imagination begins to fill the gaps. Each person begins to form a picture of the other, not based on full knowledge, but on fragments. Observed behavior. Family reputation. Social expectation. In this way, anticipation becomes part of the marriage itself, not romantic anticipation in the modern sense, but structural anticipation. What will life look like after this union? How will responsibilities be shared? How will households merge or adjust? What will change, and what will remain? In noble courts, this anticipation can feel almost like a slow unfolding of strategy. Guests and families watch, interpret, and prepare for the consequences of the union. Every interaction is quietly noted. In villages, anticipation is quieter but no less real. Neighbors observe. Families prepare spaces. Work is reorganized. Life adjusts around the approaching shift. And through all of it, the couple remains at the center of expectation, even if they barely know each other, even if their understanding is incomplete, even if their future is still unclear. This is one of the most distinctive aspects of medieval arranged marriage. It does not begin with emotional certainty, it begins with social structure, and grows into personal reality over time, as days pass after the first impression. That initial moment begins to fade into memory. But it does not disappear. It becomes the foundation upon which later understanding is built. When we imagine a medieval wedding, it is easy to picture a single day, one long stretch of music, feasting, and ritual that rises and then quietly ends as night falls, but in reality, the celebration rarely fit inside such a narrow frame. A medieval wedding was not a moment, it was a sequence, a widening circle of events that stretched before and after the ceremony itself, sometimes blending into ordinary life so gradually that no one could clearly mark where celebration ended and routine began. In noble households especially, the festivities could extend across multiple days. Feasts might be held in stages, with different groups of guests arriving at different times. Local lords, distant relatives, political allies, and household retainers all expected acknowledgement. Each group brought its own weight of expectation, conversation, and ceremony. The great hall would not simply fill once and empty again. It would cycle, fill, empty, refill, each gathering slightly different in tone, each meal slightly different in arrangement, each evening blending music, conversation, and controlled celebration beneath torchlight and candle glow. But even this structured rhythm was not purely indulgent, it served a purpose. Marriage was a public confirmation of alliance, inheritance, and continuity. The longer the celebration, the more visible the union became. The more witnesses, the stronger the social recognition of the marriage itself. In a world where documentation was limited and authority often depended on shared acknowledgement, celebration functioned as proof. In peasant communities, the pattern was different but still extended beyond a single day. The wedding might begin with a church ceremony, followed by a communal meal shared among villagers. Bread, ale, and simple dishes prepared by multiple households created a sense of shared participation. But the social meaning of the marriage did not end when the meal ended. Neighbors would continue to acknowledge the couple in the days that followed. Visits might continue. Small contributions of food or goods might be offered. The household itself would gradually absorb the new structure of the marriage into daily life. In this sense, celebration dissolved into community. It did not stop abruptly, it faded slowly. One of the most important reasons medieval celebrations lasted longer than modern expectations is because life itself was slower. Travel was slow, communication was slow, work cycles were slow, so transitions in life were also slow. A marriage did not simply begin and end like a scheduled event. It unfolded across time, shaped by availability of resources, arrival of guests, and the natural rhythm of rural and noble life. Even religious influence contributed to this extended structure. Certain feast days and holy periods could either extend celebrations or interrupt them, depending on the liturgical calendar. A wedding held near a major feast might blend into larger religious festivities already underway in the community. This created overlapping layers of celebration, personal, social, religious, all coexisting within the same stretch of days. Inside a noble castle, this overlapping could feel almost like controlled chaos beneath surface order. Servants preparing food continuously. Musicians performing at intervals. Guests moving between halls, chambers, and courtyards. Conversation shifting between formal discussions and informal gatherings, yet beneath it all, there is structure, because even extended celebration in the Middle Ages was not random, it followed expectation, it followed hierarchy, and it followed the practical limits of food, space, and labor. For peasants, the limits were more immediate. A celebration could not continue indefinitely because daily work demanded attention. Fields needed tending. Animals needed care. Tools needed repair. So the celebration would stretch just enough to honor the occasion, then gradually return to routine. And this return to routine is important because it reveals something subtle about medieval life. Celebration was never separate from labor, it existed alongside it, not as escape, but as interruption within continuity, even within extended festivities. There were moments of pause that felt closer to ordinary life than to ceremony. A quiet conversation beside a fire after guests had left. A shared meal with close family once the larger gathering dispersed. A moment of rest before returning to work. These moments often carried more emotional weight than the larger public events, because they were quieter, more intimate, less structured. As days pass after the wedding, the intensity of celebration slowly reduces, music becomes less frequent, crowds thin, food preparation returns to normal scale, and the household begins to settle into its new configuration. The couple, now officially integrated into their shared life, begins to experience marriage not as an event, but as continuity, and perhaps this is where medieval celebration differs most from modern imagination. It is not sharply separated from life, it is woven into it. Like threads in fabric, visible at first, then gradually becoming part of the structure itself. Eventually, there is no clear boundary between wedding and after wedding. Only life continuing, but changed, and as the final remnants of celebration fade, a quieter reality begins to emerge beneath the surface, because after the feasting ends, after the guests depart, and after the household returns to rhythm, the couple must face something far more enduring than ceremony: daily life. The final echo of celebration does not end with a sound, it fades, slowly, like smoke thinning into morning air, or footprints disappearing on a path after rain. By now, the wedding has passed through every stage it was meant to occupy: ritual, feast, gathering, and extended social acknowledgement. The household has been witnessed, recognized, and accepted, and now, something quieter begins, not another ceremony, not another public moment, but ordinary life. In medieval society, this transition was not abrupt. There was no clear boundary where wedding life stopped and normal life began. Instead, the shift happened gradually, almost invisibly, as days resumed their familiar rhythm. The fires still needed tending, the fields still needed labor, the household still needed structure, and so the couple steps into a shared existence that feels less like a new beginning and more like an adjustment within an already moving world. Inside a peasant home, this transition is immediate and practical. The morning after the last guest leaves, tools are picked up again. Water is carried. Bread is baked. Animals are fed. The rhythm of survival resumes without pause. There is no extended separation between celebration and responsibility. They exist side by side. A shared meal may still be slightly special for a day or two, leftover food from festivities, a quieter moment at the table, but even that gradually dissolves into normal preparation. The household economy cannot remain paused for long. In noble households, the transition takes on a different shape, not lighter, just more structured. Servants return fully to routine duties. Household accounts are updated. Guests depart for distant estates. Letters are sent. Political matters that were temporarily softened by celebration now return to focus. The couple, now officially established within the household, begins to take on defined roles: management of estates, oversight of servants, participation in courtly or political expectations. The wedding did not remove them from responsibility, it formalized it. What changes most during this transition is perception. Before marriage, Life is anticipation. During the wedding, life is performance. Afterward, life becomes maintenance, and maintenance, in the medieval world, is constant. Nothing stays still for long. Even emotional adjustment happens within the boundaries of work. Conversations occur while performing tasks. Understanding grows during shared labor. Familiarity develops not through isolation, but through repetition, carrying water together, working in fields side by side, sitting near the hearth after long hours of effort. These small shared moments slowly replace the intensity of earlier ceremony. In many ways, medieval marriage reveals itself most clearly not in its beginning, but in its continuation, because the structure of life leaves little room for pause. And so the relationship is shaped by what fills the space after celebration ends. Daily rhythm becomes the foundation of connection. Outside, the world continues its slow cycle. Seasons shift. Crops grow and are harvested. Animals are bred and tended. Markets open and close. Trade moves through towns and villages with steady persistence. Life is not dramatic, it is continuous, and marriage fits into that continuity like another thread in a woven fabric, strong, unbroken, but also ordinary. Over time, the memory of the wedding itself begins to soften. Not disappear, but settle into background. What once felt ceremonial becomes remembered as a starting point rather than an ongoing event. The household now defines itself by routine rather than ritual. Who wakes first? Who tends the fire? Who manages food? Who oversees work? These patterns become more important than the memory of feasting or celebration, and yet, small echoes of the wedding remain: a piece of fabric from the ceremony, a cup used during the feast, a memory of guests, music, and gathering. These reminders do not interrupt daily life, they sit within it quietly. As the days pass, something subtle but important happens. The couple begins to recognize each other not as figures shaped by expectation, but as people shaped by shared experience, not through dramatic revelation, but through familiarity. The way someone moves when tired, the way they respond to difficulty, the way silence feels between them during long work. This is where medieval marriage becomes fully real, not in ceremony, not in celebration, but in repetition. And in the absence of spectacle, there is no final moment that marks this transition, no announcement, no public acknowledgement, only the slow replacement of ritual with routine. And in that routine, life continues, unremarkable, stable, demanding, and quietly shared. As the medieval world moves forward into its endless cycle of seasons and labor, the couple's life becomes part of something larger than themselves, not isolated, not separate, but integrated into the structure of everyday existence. And yet, beneath this ordinary surface, another truth begins to form, because even in routine, change continues, and over time, that change leads not backward into celebration, but forward into something more permanent, a shared life that no longer remembers its beginning as clearly as it once did. By now, the story has moved through every layer of medieval marriage, from the public feast to the private chamber, from ritual to responsibility, from celebration to the slow, steady rhythm of daily life, and what remains at the end is not a single dramatic conclusion, but something quieter, more enduring, more human. In the medieval world, a honeymoon was never truly a journey away from life. It was not an escape into distant luxury or private isolation. It was a transition, carefully shaped by tradition, necessity, and the structures of society that surrounded every household. It began in public, it passed through ritual, and it settled into routine. What people remember as romance today was, for medieval couples, often something more grounded. A shared existence formed not in separation from the world, but within it, under the same roofs, beside the same hearths, along the same fields and corridors that defined everyday survival. And yet, within that simplicity, life was not empty. It was full of small meanings: a shared meal after long labor, a quiet glance across a crowded room, a moment of understanding formed not through grand declarations, but through repetition and time. Medieval marriage did not promise escape, it promised continuity, and continuity, in a world shaped by uncertainty, was its own kind of comfort. Across castles and cottages, noble estates and rural villages, life followed the same unbroken pattern. Seasons changed, work continued, children were born, communities shifted slowly across generations, and within that movement, marriage remained one of the central threads holding life together. Not always gentle, not always chosen freely in the modern sense, but deeply embedded in the structure of survival, the honeymoon, as it was understood in fragments of medieval tradition, becomes less about sweetness alone and more about transition itself, a brief space where the world acknowledges change before returning to its usual rhythm, a moment suspended between ceremony and reality, and once that moment passes, life does what it always does: it continues, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like fire burning low in a hearth through the night, like wind moving across fields under a quiet sky, like time itself, passing without interruption. The couple, now fully integrated into household life, no longer stands at the center of attention. The guests have gone. The rituals have ended. The celebration has faded into memory. What remains is shared existence, work, responsibility, familiarity slowly built through days that feel ordinary, but accumulate meaning over time. And perhaps that is where the true medieval honeymoon ends, not in departure, not in arrival, but in acceptance, acceptance of a shared world that does not pause for ceremony, but absorbs it and moves forward. Outside, night settles gently over the medieval landscape, villages grow quiet, castles dim their torches, fields rest beneath a sky filled with distant stars, and in that stillness, life continues its quiet rhythm, unchanged by any single story, yet shaped by all of them. Together, every marriage, every household, every small beginning that becomes part of something larger, and so, as we step away from the past and return to silence, the final image is not one of grandeur or spectacle, but of peace, of ordinary life continuing in its steady way, of time moving forward without urgency. And now, as the candlelight fades and the world grows soft at the edges, there is nothing more to see, nothing more to explain, only rest, only stillness, only the quiet ending of a long journey through history. Good night.